Sevarog has been one heck of a hero ever since he was introduced way back in early access. Very, very early access. He's quite the beast. Hard to play, hard by design, hard to execute, and he's a force to be reckoned with. When we're talking about reworking Sevarog, adding in a passive, ironically, there wasn't much left to do. Hello ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Hero Rework video. I am Sylphin, and a few things right off the bat, like always. One, we have to add hero passives, and for Sevarog at least, it's kind of pretty simple if you asked me. Two, this is just my idea along with what I came up with the community, so this is in no way represents what Unleashed Games is going to do at all. Three, need to add in a quest mechanic, at least for me personally. I think that quest mechanics are very cool. If you perform something well within a hero's kit, you know, you just do well, you get rewarded for it, and it gets empowered. So, for Sevarog, what is his gameplay niche and his theme that you emphasize to make him relevant in the hero roster? There has to be a reason for you to say, aha, I need Sevarog in this team comp against this other team comp because of these reasons. Well, for Sevarog, in my opinion, it's because he is a utility hyper tank. Utility hyper tank. Utility being he has a root and he has a knockback, and he has a pretty good mobility with his Phantom Rush. His hyper tank, he can become an extreme tank in the late game. Yeah, he's bruisery and tanky in the early game and mid game, but he really scales up in the late game. If you need a super duper tank in the late game, Sevarog is the guy to go to. So how do we emphasize that in his kit? Well, there wasn't much work to be done, to be honest with you. Check this out. It didn't need to change him very much. His passive part is at 20, 60, 120, 200 stacks of his Sylphin stacks. Sevarog gains additional health and ability damage. It's what it was before. That was just a part of his Sylphin before, but that just becomes part of his passive. At certain stacks, he gains additional health and ability damage. Why ability damage? Because you'll see something in his subjugate a little bit later on that helps him with the hyper tank nature. Also, something with Sevarog is that he actually kind of did pretty good damage as well. That was more, at least in my opinion, just because he was more of a hyper hero. If you're going to suffer in the early game and mid game, you're going to have to get a lot of value in the late game. And yes, he is a tank, but he actually does a lot of damage. And in order to be a tank, you have to have threat. Usually that comes in the form of crowd control. And while Sevarog has lots of crowd control, he's a hyper hero. So he needs lots of crowd control and a lot of damage too to produce that tank, to produce that threat, to be a hyper tank. So it's just, he's a lot. He's a lot. He's a lot to deal with. And we want to emphasize that in his kit. So should those stacks be more? 20, 60, 120, 180, 200, 20, 60, 100, 140, 200, something like that? Should you add another level in there? Maybe, but at least this, I mean, you get the concept. You need to get a lot of stacks to get a lot of additional health and ability damage, hence hyperness. Now his Phantom Rush was his mobility ability. He could rush through minions, rush through heroes a fair distance. Again, that would have to be tweaked for a larger non-monolith-like map. And that, remember guys, numbers in this, just forget the numbers because the balance team, that's kind of their job. What I want to do is instead present to you a concept, an idea through these things. So just forget about the numbers. Phantom Rush, he would go far. He can use that quite often, with cooldown reduction being going to be a thing in Unleashed Games Paragon 2, whatever it's going to be called. That can really help all of his abilities, as he is very much a ability-focused tank. Phantom Rush, a very key part of making Sevarog effective, as it really goes well into his Subjugate and Colossal Blow, and you'll see that coming up. Sylphin. This is his main ability, and I really toyed with the idea of leaving his Sylphin stacks just from anything that Sevarog kills with any ability. A lot of chat was like, make it back to what it used to be. High skill cap hero, high execution threshold. You know what? I came around and I was like, yeah, you know what? Sylphin is the only thing that builds up those stacks. Does the cooldown have to be reduced? Likely. Just a little bit. 2.5. I think it used to be 2.5, maybe? I don't know. It's his old Sylphin. Sevarog rips the enemy's soul, dealing damage in a small area in front of him. 3-second cooldown, 2.5, whatever it has to be. Sevarog gains soul stacks from enemies he executes with Sylphin, gaining 1 health and 0.5 ability damage, or whatever those numbers need to be, stacking up to 200 times, maybe making it stacking infinite times. Who knows? It's his old Sylphin. His Sylphin is the only way to gain those stacks. Obviously, the mana cost will have to be lower. Cooldown likely lower too. It's his old Sylphin. He's a high skill cap. You know, high risk. You know, he scales into the late game, not necessarily the early and mid game. But if you can execute well with him, you will be rewarded. That's his Sylphin. It's his old Sylphin back. Subjugate. Very, very key ability for Sevarog. And if you can land this ability well, yeah, you can be pretty much the biggest threat on an enemy team, at least in my opinion. A really good Sevarog is the scariest thing on the planet. Subjugate every 12 seconds, or whatever that needs to be. Sevarog can root enemies in the target location for 1.5 seconds. Once there's that little delay, it's not a cast, but just animation delay, dealing damage in a small area. Affected enemies are slowed by 20% for 1.5 seconds after being rooted. After rooting 15 enemy heroes, or 20 or 25, whatever that has to be to make that into late game, Sevarog gains 20% damage reduction from rooted targets for 6 seconds. Why that? Well, his passive gives him additional health and ability damage, as well as just his Sylphin stacks and those empowered stacks from his passive. So he's gaining health and damage from that. But the scariest thing about Sevarog, one of the best things about Sevarog, is that he's the playmaker. He's the ganker, or he's just the initiator. He's both a hyper tank and an initiator with that Phantom Rush and Subjugate. What you need, though, in order to do that is straight up tankiness in order to just literally charge right into the enemy team. He's one of the only tanks that can do that besides Steel. Rampage, you could just leap into them, but he is more of a stain. Anyways, Sevarog, you need that health, that tankiness to literally subjugate and just charge into an enemy team. That also means that if you can land the subjugate well, period, you unlock this quest mechanic in a subjugate. But if you land it well after it's unlocked, you gain 20% damage reduction from rooted targets for 6 seconds, because you're likely going to be subjugating high priority targets. A carry, a couple assassins, something like that. As soon as you do that and you rush in, you want that damage mitigation so you can focus them, have incredibly high threat on high value targets, forcing the enemy team to respond to you, fulfilling your role. There you go. So as you can see, that is how that works into his kit. You gain damage reduction for rooted targets, making you want to subjugate high value targets, high damage dealing targets to more fulfill your role, draw the enemy team to you, etc., like I just explained. It's interesting after rooting. I don't know how many heroes that has to be, but hopefully that all makes sense and really brings out his purpose in a team fight, and especially in that draft lobby. Colossal Blow is the same. It's the same. It's the same as it used to be. It's the same as it was. It didn't really change all that much. It was on a relatively low cooldown. dealt great damage, knocked back enemy heroes. It was a great ability. Really didn't need to be changed too much in my opinion, and serves the wondrous purpose of knocking enemy heroes into unfavorable positions. And that is Sevarog. Really didn't need much change in my opinion. Just flip-flopping of what was, you know, just what the passive is. Originally it was on his Sylphin, but then I realized that if your passive is to gain stacks from enemies you execute with Sylphin, but you don't have Sylphin unlocked, you know, it's kind of weird, right? So we just had to flip that around. He doesn't need to be changed, and I think people will appreciate that. Let me know down in the comments what you guys think. Sevarog, he's a beast, and I think he was fantastic, and I would love to play this Sevarog. Please like the video if you like it, dislike it, share it with the community. Of course, guys, subscribe if you guys want more content like this about Unleashed games and Paragon 2. Let me know down in the comments and discuss this video. Till next time, like always, guys, stay positive and optimistic.